Dawn came in hard and clean over Reagan National's military arrivals apron, and Sentinel Darren Rodriguez stood at ceremonial attention beside the transfer lane as if Marble had taken an oath and learned to breathe. His boots held a mirror shine that caught the first pale light. White gloves pristine against dark wool. Jaw set, eyes locked on a point only he could see. Beyond the access road, Arlington's white headstones climbed the hill in disciplined rows, and every person near the barricade fell quiet in the presence of that geometry of sacrifice. Cold mist drifted low past the edge of the runway fencing, carrying the sharp scent of jet fuel and wet concrete, and the whole scene felt less like an airport than an annex of a cathedral where movement itself required permission. Ground crews, who normally worked with brisk, practical gestures, took smaller steps. A baggage cart idled farther back than it needed to. Even the gulls that circled over the Potomac seemed to keep their distance from the painted lane where the military detail waited. Darren did not move. He did not need to. Discipline did the speaking for him. He stood 6'2", broad through the shoulders, built like a wall that had learned to march, with dark hair cropped close beneath his service cap and a face that gave away nothing. His uniform was immaculate in the old, uncompromising way, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, brass bright and exact, ribbons aligned with mathematical precision, collar set true. The Tomb Guard identification badge sat above his heart, small to an untrained eye, immense to anyone who understood what it required. He held himself with that particular stillness that was never passive. To the crowd he looked carved from stone. Inside, every sense remained active, cataloging space, distance, noise, and risk with the silent efficiency of a soldier who had seen crowded places turn dangerous without warning. The crowd along the temporary barrier became a portrait of the country he served. A weathered Marine in a faded unit cap stood with both hands on a cane fitted with a Purple Heart plate, his spine straighter than his years should have allowed. Two teenagers in school hoodies lowered their phones without being told and tucked them into their pockets, chastened by a silence they had not expected to feel. A mother in a denim jacket gently adjusted her young son's elbow until his uncertain hand found a proper salute, then left him there, eyes wide, trying his best to hold it steady. A retired Army nurse with silver hair and steady posture watched Darren's chest for half a second, saw the badge, and inhaled as recognition passed through her like a current. Near her, a little girl in a wheelchair sat wrapped in a red blanket, despite the season, fingers curled around a folded flag patch stitched to the armrest. Nobody announced what this lane represented. Nobody needed to. Every American in that line knew, at least in fragments, what was coming down that tarmac. They knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, somebody's son or daughter had been loaded into a solemn chain of custody, and that this ribbon of painted concrete had become the final corridor between war and home. They knew why the uniforms were perfect. That was why voices dropped, and they understood how one sentinel standing motionless could make a terminal full of civilians remember words like duty and vow and cost. Darren's breathing stayed slow and controlled. Beneath his right ear, a faint shrapnel scar rested in the shadow where his jaw met his neck, barely visible unless morning light hit at an angle. He never touched it. He never needed to. It was simply there, as permanent as the habits he carried from mountains of dust and broken stone half a world away. He had learned long ago that composure was not the absence of memory. It was memory held in formation. 30 feet behind him, 2 military police officers maintained perimeter distance, careful not to intrude into ceremonial space unless ordered. They had already received the briefing. No unnecessary motion through the lane, no radio chatter above a murmur, no interruption once transfer commands began. Their restraint was not hesitation. It was respect for protocol older than either man. A civilian airport supervisor in a neon vest stood farther back with a clipboard pressed to her chest, speaking only in hand signals to her team, so the hush remained unbroken. At the edge of the crowd, retired Sergeant First Class Thomas Kellen kept both hands folded over the top of his umbrella, even though the morning had not yet decided to rain. He wore a dark coat over a pressed shirt and old cavalry boots polished enough to reveal habit, and his face carried the hard map of a man who had spent years giving orders under pressure, and then years afterward living with the echo of them. Beside him stood his grandson Bryce, 17, expensive sneakers clean enough to advertise themselves, phone in one hand, restless energy in every shift of his weight. Bryce had not yet learned how to stand still for anything he did not choose. Thomas noticed, corrected him with a quiet touch to the elbow, and Bryce straightened for exactly 3 breaths before drifting again. Darren saw them all without looking at them. That was the discipline outsiders never understood. Attention was not blindness. Stillness was not softness. He tracked the old sergeant's bearing, the teenager's wandering gaze, the child in the wheelchair, the 2 high school boys trying to imitate military quiet, the nurse whose expression had already moved from curiosity to reverence. He measured the standoff distance between barricade and lane. He noted the reflection off a terminal window that could momentarily obscure peripheral vision if the sun rose another few degrees. He counted the seconds between aircraft engine pulses in the distance. In his mind, variables settled into place like rounds in a magazine. A gust swept across the apron and tugged at coat hems and loose hair, but it could not move him. There was a reason men like Darren were called Sentinels. The title meant more than guard. It meant witness. It meant continuity. It meant a living promise that while the rest of the world rushed, forgot, scrolled, complained, upgraded, and moved on, somebody would remain exactly where honor required him to stand. The little girl in the wheelchair leaned toward her mother and whispered, "Is he a statue?" Her mother shook her head softly. "No, sweetheart. He's a soldier." The girl studied Darren with solemn concentration, as children do when they meet a kind of seriousness they have never seen in school assemblies or movies. She looked at the white gloves and the polished shoes and the rigid line of his shoulders, then at the distant cemetery crest above the road. Her eyes did what the country sometimes struggled to do. She connected the symbols at once. The retired nurse stepped half a pace closer to the barrier and spoke in a low voice to no one in particular, though everyone near her heard. "That badge means tomb guard. They don't borrow that discipline for a photo op. They carry it everywhere." A high school boy nearest her swallowed and nodded, suddenly aware of his own slouch. He straightened and removed his cap. His friend did the same, clumsy but sincere. The elderly Marine shifted his cane to his left side, raised his right hand, and held a precise salute that made his shoulder tremble. Thomas Kellen saw the gesture and returned one of his own, crisp from muscle memory, eyes forward. Darren remained what the duty demanded, unflinching, silent, exact. Yet inside him the sacred arithmetic kept running. Mission lane clear, crowd mostly compliant, vulnerable civilian at 9 o'clock in wheelchair, accompanied. 2 law enforcement support elements behind. 1 adolescent male with elevated movement and device fixation. Right flank near barricade break. No immediate direct threat. Continue posture. Maintain authority through composure. He could feel the weight of the morning building by the second, not as pressure, but as inheritance. Men whose names he spoke only in private had stood watch before him and would stand watch after him. The place changed, from marble plaza to airport concrete, from wind through cemetery oaks to turbine wash and fuel haze, but the vow did not change. Protect the dignity of the fallen. Protect the families receiving them. Protect the line between sacred duty and public spectacle. That line might be painted on asphalt today, but it carried the same force as marble. A service vehicle rolled to a stop 100 yards away and cut its engine. The sudden absence of mechanical rumble deepened the hush. Somewhere behind the terminal glass, a departure gate announced boarding for a vacation flight, cheerful and bright and oblivious. On the apron, nobody moved toward leisure. Every face pointed toward the transfer lane. Bryce Kellen glanced around, read the silence as an audience, and lifted his phone a little higher. Thomas saw it and gave one quiet order, not loud, not theatrical. The voice of a grandfather and a sergeant fused into one command. "Pocket it." Bryce lowered it halfway, then hesitated, eyes flicking from his grandfather to Darren's unmoving profile, and back to the bright screen reflecting his own face. That hesitation hung in the cold morning, like a held breath, thin and fragile, while the Sentinel held the line and the country watched. Bryce let the phone hover in his palm, gave his grandfather a thin smile that belonged to locker rooms and comment sections, and then looked past him at Darren as if the Sentinel were a stage prop instead of a soldier. "It's just a video," he said, low but sharp, and thumbed the screen live. Thomas Kellen's jaw tightened. "Pocket it." In less than 2 seconds, defiance hardened into performance. Bryce took one step toward the barricade break, squared his shoulders to his own camera, and pitched his voice high enough for the nearest travelers to hear. "Watch this. Airport's got a toy soldier blocking real people." Several heads turned at once. The high school boys, who had just removed their caps, stiffened. The retired nurse went still, eyes locked on Bryce's hand. The little girl in the wheelchair frowned, not understanding the words but hearing the contempt in them. Darren did not move. Bryce mistook that stillness for permission. He shifted the phone to his left hand, grabbed the half-full sports bottle from his backpack side pocket, and gave it a careless little toss first, testing weight like a pitcher warming up. Thomas reached for his sleeve and missed by inches. "Bryce, stand down." The teenager snorted, pointed the bottle toward Darren's chest, and sneered, "Move, parade boy." Then he whipped it. The bottle spun end over end through cold morning haze, a bright plastic arc against gray tarmac and polished metal, and every witness tracked it with the same terrible clarity. It struck hard near Darren's rifle-side boot, burst its cap loose, and skidded across the painted transfer lane in a splash of neon sports drink that looked obscene against the clean geometry of ceremonial space. The crowd froze. Rolling luggage stopped mid-wheel. A mother's hand clamped around her son's shoulder and held there. The elderly Marine's salute never dropped, but his eyes widened with a fury old soldiers reserve for one kind of insult only. One tourist inhaled through his teeth and whispered, "No, no, no, no." The airport police at the perimeter shifted half a pace forward, then checked themselves, uncertain where enforcement ended, and military protocol began. Their radios stayed quiet. Their faces did not. Thomas Kellen stood as if someone had struck him in the sternum. Shame crossed his face in one visible wave, from confusion to recognition, to anger at the boy and at himself for bringing him here without understanding how little reverence he carried. "What did you just do?" he said, each word flat and heavy. "Do you have any idea where you are?" Bryce kept the phone up for one more second, waiting for laughs that did not come. No one laughed. What he had not known, what no one in his live feed could have guessed from polished shoes and ceremonial wool was that the man he had mocked had spent years moving through blast dust and broken compounds where one thrown object could be a bomb, one distraction could kill civilians, and one wrong judgment could bury a squad. Bryce saw a uniform. He did not see Afghanistan ridgelines, Syria alleyways, or the Bronze Star pinned for valor earned under fire. He saw a still figure and assumed emptiness. He had thrown at silence and hit a vow. Darren's breathing never changed. Externally, he remained carved from discipline, gaze fixed, shoulders square, white gloves steady. Inside, the old combat calculus lit up with absolute speed. Object trajectory complete. Splash pattern contained. Thrower identified. Secondary objects possible. Crowd density high. Child in wheelchair at 9 o'clock, protected by adult. 2 perimeter officers awaiting cue. Mission priority remained unchanged. Preserve dignity of transfer lane, prevent escalation, hold the sacred line. The little girl leaned toward her mother and whispered, "Did he hurt the soldier?" Her mother swallowed. "No, sweetheart, but he disrespected something sacred." The retired nurse answered without taking her eyes off Darren. "And that matters." A man in a business coat near the back muttered, "Kid just ended his mourning." Another answered, "He ended his grandfather's peace." Thomas finally moved, one hand clamping Bryce's forearm, the grip of a former sergeant who had corrected men under live rounds. Bryce tried to pull free, embarrassment flashing now that the crowd offered no approval, only judgment. "Let go. It didn't even hit him." Thomas pulled him closer, voice low enough to cut steel. "You did not throw at a man. You threw at the fallen." The words landed harder than the bottle had. Darren heard every syllable. He held position. The ceremonial lane remained violated until corrected. And correction had to come with precision, not impulse. That was the burden of sacred duty in profane places. No matter how juvenile the insult, the response had to honor the dead first, authority second, and ego never. Jet turbines rumbled in the far distance. Somewhere behind terminal glass, a vending machine hummed. On the apron, nobody breathed comfortably. The hush held, heavy and self-enforcing, as if the air itself understood that any careless sound would be another trespass. Cold over Reagan National carried a blade-edge bite that found every seam in a coat, and mist hung low across the access roads where military transport vehicles moved with deliberate spacing. The transfer lane had been marked before sunrise, measured to inches, cleared by airport operations, and held under quiet coordination between military district staff and civilian authorities who knew this was not routine logistics. It was homecoming under guard. It was a final corridor. By the second week of October, crews on that apron had learned to recognize these mornings by posture alone. Fewer jokes, radios turned down, motions clipped and respectful, eyes tracking the lane with an attention no supervisor had to demand. Darren stood at the center of that ritual in full old guard precision, and every element of his uniform carried meaning beyond fabric. The kepi sat at exact angle. Brass caught light like small suns. His gloves stayed immaculate despite fuel haze and damp air. His boots held a mirror finish that reflected runway lights in thin silver lines. The Tomb Guard badge above his heart remained modest in size and vast in implication, the mark of a sentinel entrusted with the most sacred watch in American military memory. To travelers rushing gates, he could have looked ceremonial. To veterans, he looked like doctrine made human. Across the barricade, witness faces told their own history. The Marine with the Purple Heart plate braced on his cane and kept his salute. because he understood what breaches do if no one answers them. The two high school boys had gone pale, their earlier curiosity replaced by a sober alertness that comes when adolescence collides with consequence. The mother with the young boy pressed two fingers gently to her son's wrist to steady his shaking salute, and the boy refused to lower it. The retired Army nurse, shoulders squared, watched Darren with the grave focus of someone who had signed too many casualty transfer forms to ever confuse ceremony with theater. Near her, the little girl in the wheelchair sat wrapped in her red blanket, a patch from her father's unit stitched to the armrest, where her thumb kept tracing its border. She had asked if Darren was a statue because children search for familiar categories. Now she watched him as if she had discovered a new one. Not statue, Sentinel. And at the fault line of the moment stood Thomas and Bryce Kellen, two generations divided by what service had taught one and what comfort had hidden from the other. Thomas had seen convoys, sandstorms, memorial ramps under floodlights, and the private silence that follows folded flags. Bryce had seen clips, trends, and applause measured in hearts on a screen. Thomas wore discipline like old leather, creased but unbroken. Bryce wore confidence like glass, bright and brittle. The bottle lay on its side in the lane between them and Darren, still leaking in a thin fluorescent trail that crept toward painted markings no civilian foot was meant to cross. That small stream became the visible problem everyone could point to. Beneath it ran the larger fracture no camera could frame as easily. The widening gap between those who remember the cost and those who inherit the freedom without ever being taught its price. Darren did not allow himself anger. He allowed assessment. His instincts were on high alert, every muscle coiled beneath ceremonial stillness. But control held absolute. He tracked Bryce's breathing, Thomas's grip, police stance, crowd compression at the barrier, and the exact distance to the contaminated point in the lane. He noted the airport supervisor signaling her team to halt all nearby cart motion. He noted a military police corporal waiting for permission he would not take without clear cue. He noted most of all that the dignity of the transfer corridor had to be restored in a way every witness would understand. Not punishment first, reverence first. A hush settled so deep that when one dropped suitcase handle clacked against concrete 40 feet away, half the crowd flinched. Thomas released Bryce's arm only long enough to take the phone from his grandson's hand and switch off the live stream with his thumb. He did not throw it. He folded it shut and held it in his coat pocket like evidence. "You will stand where I tell you," he said. "You will listen. You will learn." Bryce's face flushed, bravado draining in strips. "Grandpa, it was a joke." Thomas looked at him with the kind of grief that does not raise its voice. Jokes are for equals in safety. This lane carries people who paid in full. The retired nurse closed her eyes for a brief second, as if the line had reached something raw and true. Darren remained silent, but silence now had shape. The crowd could feel a response forming, not from temper, but from authority rooted in tradition older than anyone present except the memories they all carried. He had not yet moved, and that restraint amplified the gravity rather than reducing it. In sacred duty, there is a time to hold. Then there is a time to act. 30 seconds passed and felt like an hour. The mist thinned. Light sharpened. No one looked away from the sentinel in the lane, the boy at the barrier, and the grandfather who understood that the next words spoken on that concrete would either cheapen the morning or restore it. By 6:12 a.m., the airport had become a chapel of held breath. The wind came off the Potomac in narrow, cold currents that slid beneath collars and cuffs, carrying the layered smell of river water jet exhaust and rain-dark pavement. Beyond chain link and service roads, Arlington rose in disciplined terraces, white stones catching the gray-blue dawn until they looked like ranks of silent sentries, taking attendance for the nation's missing. The transfer lane itself, bordered by painted lines and temporary stanchions, seemed to glow with a hard, clean purpose under the floodlights that had not yet clicked off. Nothing in that corridor was accidental. Not one cone, not one footprint, not one angle of approach. Darren Rodriguez stood at its center as the fixed point every other motion obeyed. His coat sat perfectly weighted over his shoulders, seams straight, brass aligned, no loose thread permitted to interrupt the geometry. The kepi was canted with exact regulation precision, brim casting a narrow shadow over eyes that remained forward, unreadable, disciplined to a depth that civilians often confused with emotional distance. His white gloves were unmarked despite the fuel haze and damp morning grit, fingertips aligned with trouser seams in a posture that turned stillness into command. The Tomb Guard identification badge over his heart caught a brief shard of rising light and held it, a small metal emblem carrying years of selection, attrition, and sacred trust. His boots, mirror-bright, reflected painted lines and floodlight glare in razor-thin streaks, as if even the concrete beneath him had been ordered into formation. The crowd at the barrier did what crowds rarely do in modern places. It chose restraint. The retired Marine with the Purple Heart plate on his cane kept his salute locked, jaw rigid, old tendons trembling under the weight of memory and respect. The two high school boys who had tucked away their phones stood shoulder to shoulder now, hats off, their faces stripped of teenage swagger, trying with visible effort to match the seriousness in front of them. The mother in denim remained behind her son, her hand no longer correcting his elbow because he had found the angle on his own and refused to lower it. The retired Army nurse, silver hair pinned tight, watched with a clinician's clarity and a veteran's ache, seeing not simply a soldier in ceremonial wool, but the procedural chain of custody, the transfer forms, the families waiting by doorways, the ritual that kept grief from becoming chaos. Near her, the little girl in the wheelchair sat wrapped in red, fingers still tracing the stitched patch on her armrest, lips pressed together in that fierce way children use when they decide to be brave in public. Her mother knelt beside her, one hand on the wheel rim, one hand over her daughter's shoulder, eyes wet but steady. A pilot in off-duty slacks had stopped 20 feet back and removed his cap. A baggage handler with orange hearing protectors hanging around his neck stood motionless beside a tug cart he had forgotten to park. Two airport police officers remained on the perimeter exactly as briefed, weight forward, ready to act, yet careful not to cross ceremonial space without military direction. Even the civilian supervisor in a reflective vest had lowered her clipboard to her side, silent now, watching the lane as if it were holy ground parceled temporarily onto airport asphalt. Thomas Kellen stayed close to Bryce, one hand closed around his grandson's forearm, the other resting against the coat pocket where he had secured the phone. His profile had hardened into the old NCO face. Not loud, not theatrical, just settled into responsibility. Bryce avoided his eyes, then risked a glance toward the bottle leaking across the line. The fluorescent drink had slowed to a thin, uneven thread that crawled toward a drainage groove and stopped there, bright against gray concrete like a mark that did not belong. It was a trivial mess in practical terms. It was a grave insult in moral terms. Everyone present understood the difference. What no one in that crowd could fully see was how much work Darren was doing without moving a muscle. He tracked the nearest hands, nearest exits, nearest points of compression in the barrier line. He noted that the Marine's cane was secure, The child's chair brakes were set, the police line remained clear, and no second object had been raised. He cataloged wind direction in case a command had to carry over engine noise. He measured the distance from his current position to the bottle, to Bryce, to Thomas, to each support element, building options in silence. Training did not relax because the threat looked immature. Training became stricter when the sacred had been breached by carelessness rather than malice, because the response had to teach without degrading the institution being defended. His face did not change, but memory moved behind it with controlled force. That was always true in moments like this. Sacred duty at home stirred old terrain abroad. Years earlier, before the badge, before the airport lanes and marble steps, Darren had been a young infantryman in the 10th Mountain Division with shoulders still filling out, and confidence built mostly from repetition. His first Afghanistan tour took him to Kunar's narrow valleys, where mountains squeezed roads into vulnerable ribbons, and every bend held a question. He learned quickly that fear arrived in silence first, then sound. He learned to read rooftops, culverts, and empty windows the way other men read weather. On his third week in country, his platoon sergeant told him, "Your eyes are a weapon. Use them before your rifle." Darren carried that line into every patrol after. The first tour hardened him. The second remade him. In Helmand, heat came off the earth in visible waves, and dust got into optics, food, and memory alike. He watched young soldiers age a decade in 6 months and still crack jokes over instant coffee because humor was one of the few defenses that didn't weigh anything in a ruck. That was where he met Specialist Mateo Alvarez, call sign Mace, from El Paso, grin quick, work ethic relentless. The man who could repair a stubborn generator with a multi-tool and a prayer, then make an entire squad laugh before dawn. During one exhausted night at a combat outpost, Mace fumbled an MRE heater, scorched his glove, and announced to the tent, "If I ever cook, call air support." Even the medic laughed hard enough to spill coffee. Darren laughed too, and the sound mattered, because it proved they were still human under all the armor. Mace carried photographs of his sisters taped inside a notebook and wrote letters home on folded map margins when the mail was delayed. He kept a list of birthdays for everyone in the platoon and never missed one, even if the celebration was a single instant cake crumbled into a shared mug. He also moved first when contact came, not from recklessness, but from loyalty. If someone needed pulling behind cover, Mace was already moving. If someone's radio died, he was already passing his own. Darren trusted him the way soldiers trust the man on their left in the dark. Completely, without speech. Their Syria deployment came later, with Darren now a staff sergeant and Mace still beside him. Both older, less dramatic, more precise. The terrain changed from mountain green and Afghan dust to broken urban edges and hard light bouncing off concrete. Missions demanded quick discrimination under pressure, partner force coordination, split-second calls with civilians nearby. Darren earned the Bronze Star with valor during a vehicle ambush outside a market district when he reorganized a pinned team, directed suppressive fire away from a civilian lane, and extracted 2 wounded soldiers under sustained threat. He never described that day as heroic. He described it as required. Route Redleaf came 3 months before redeployment. The convoy spacing had been textbook. Comms were clean. Visibility was decent. Then a buried charge detonated under the lead security vehicle with a force that ripped order into fragments. There was no cinematic warning, only impact, debris, noise, then training taking over before thought could catch up. Darren moved through smoke and shouted coordinates, pulled one soldier clear, then reached for the second, and felt the world tilt from another blast wave that slammed him against armored steel. That was when shrapnel carved the narrow scar behind his right ear, a hot, white line that bled, clotted, and stayed with him. Mace did not make it off Redleaf. No one needed to describe that loss in graphic detail for it to mark Darren's life permanently. The empty rack in the tent, the sealed footlocker, the folded letters returned to family, the silence at morning roll call where a voice used to answer first. Those were the wounds that remained longest. Darren stood through the ramp ceremony under floodlights, boots planted on foreign concrete, and watched the transfer case move with ceremonial precision into aircraft shadow. In that moment, he made a private vow he never voiced to command and rarely voiced to himself. If he made it home, he would spend part of whatever life remained to him guarding the memory of men like Mace with the strictest discipline he could find. That vow drew him to the old guard. Selection was not glamorous. It was attrition by detail, uniform standards measured to threads and millimeters. March cadence drilled until it lived in the body without conscious thought. Rifle manual perfected until steel and muscle moved as one line. History memorized not as trivia, but as inheritance. Errors corrected immediately, without drama, because ritual at the tomb was never performance. It was promise. Darren absorbed every standard with the same seriousness he had brought to patrol routes, because he understood the underlying equation. At the front, precision protected the living. At Arlington, precision honored the dead and steadied the living left behind. When he earned the Tomb Guard identification badge, he did not celebrate loudly. He called his mother. He called Mace's father in El Paso and said only, "I'm standing watch for him, too." On his first midnight walk at the tomb, 21 steps, pause, turn, 21 steps back, he felt the marble under his soles and the Virginia air in his lungs and recognized the same duty he had carried overseas, stripped of noise and reduced to its pure form. Witness, respect, continuity, a vow to guard their memory. That was the man Bryce had called Parade Boy. Back on the airport apron, Darren's posture remained absolute while the weight of that history settled into the present second. He could hear the faint flutter of flags near the service building, the distant whine of auxiliary power units, the involuntary swallow in Bryce's throat, the controlled breath Thomas took before deciding his next move. He could feel the crowd waiting for structure, for a line to be redrawn by authority and not by anger. The retired nurse studied him and understood with the instinct of someone who had worked too many casualty wards that this stillness was not emptiness, it was containment. It was the disciplined holding of grief, duty, and force in one human frame, so the sacred did not have to depend on volume. She leaned slightly toward the mother with the wheelchair and whispered, "Watch him now. This is how honor corrects disrespect." The mother nodded once. The little girl fixed her gaze on Darren's white gloves as if she could see the whole country's promise stitched into the seams. Thomas tightened his grip on Bryce's forearm, not cruelly, just firmly enough to end any thought of retreat. He squared his own shoulders to the lane, old cavalry boots planted, shame transformed into responsibility. Bryce's bravado had thinned to a brittle quiet. For the first time that morning, he looked less like a performer and more like a boy realizing that history can look back at you through one silent man. Darren held one more measured breath, every variable aligned, every witness present, every lesson waiting for language. He held that breath for one deliberate count, then another, and the entire apron seemed to hinge on what he would choose next. Bryce Kellen mistook that pause the same way he had mistaken everything else that morning. He read discipline as hesitation. He read silence as fear. He read a military lane prepared for fallen service members as another location where a teenager with a camera could stage himself at the center and leave with numbers. In his world, attention had become currency so early that he no longer separated being seen from being right. He had learned how to trigger a reaction long before he had learned why restraint mattered. What no one near the barricade had seen, but Thomas Kellen had feared for months, was how practiced Bryce had become at manufacturing contempt on cue. The expensive sneakers, the mirrored phone case, the little half-smirk that arrived whenever adults said no, all of it came from repetition. At school, he had turned hallway conflicts into clips. At restaurants, he had filmed workers for minor mistakes and posted edits designed to humiliate. Twice, Thomas had watched him scrub posts only after family lawyers called parents and offered private apologies backed by quiet checks. Consequence had always arrived padded, never sharp. That had taught Bryce the worst lesson a young man can learn: that embarrassment was temporary and accountability negotiable. Thomas had tried to break that pattern with stories first. 3 days earlier, driving up I-95 in a rental sedan, he had told Bryce about soldiers he had served beside who did hard things without witness and asked for nothing except that the country remember them with dignity. Bryce had stared at the window and answered with one-word acknowledgments, his attention drifting back to messages and metrics. On the hotel elevator the night before, Thomas had seen the boy rehearsing lines into his front camera, practicing expression changes like costume swaps. Even then, Thomas had believed a morning like this might reach him. He had believed that if Bryce stood in real proximity to military ritual, if he saw veterans remove their hats and mothers straighten children into a salute, some dormant respect might wake up. At 6:13 a.m., with floodlights still burning against thinning mist, that hope had cracked on concrete beside a leaking sports bottle. Bryce had not come to the apron to honor anyone. He had come because restricted space felt exclusive, and exclusivity was content. He had watched ground crews clear the lane and decided that authority only mattered until someone challenged it on camera. Darren's still posture made the challenge feel safe to him. In Bryce's imagination, men who did not posture back were decorative, like statues outside stadium. When he sneered parade boy and snapped his wrist, he was not improvising. He was executing a script he had used before, the same script where one insult establishes dominance, one reckless act triggers outrage, and one edited clip turns outrage into applause from strangers he called followers. His fatal assumption was now laid bare in front of 24 witnesses. He believed the Sentinel's discipline meant he could be provoked without consequence. He believed ceremonial authority had no teeth. He believed his grandfather's generation had exaggerated the meaning of places like this because they were sentimental, not because they carried the weight of the dead. And beneath all of it, he believed money and youth could outpace shame. Thomas looked at him and saw not evil, but a dangerous vacuum where reverence should have been. That recognition hurt more than anger. He tightened his grip and drew Bryce half a step back from the barricade break, voice low enough that only the nearest witnesses heard. "You are going to stand still. You are going to listen for once in your life. And you are going to understand what you just insulted." Bryce tried to pull away again, less forcefully this time. "It hit the ground, not him." The retired Marine answered before Thomas could. "That lane is him," he said, salute still up, words rough with age and conviction. "That lane is every one of ours." A murmur moved along the line of onlookers. Not loud, not chaotic, more like a single current passing from chest to chest. The high school boys exchanged a stunned glance. The pilot kept his cap pressed against his thigh and stared at Bryce with open disbelief. The retired nurse's expression settled into hard, clinical disapproval, the look of someone who had watched families collapse in hospital corridors and had no patience left for performative disrespect. Darren remained motionless, but his awareness sharpened further, narrowing and widening at once. He tracked Bryce's posture as bravado gave way to defensive anger. He tracked Thomas as shame stabilized into command. He tracked the police officers holding perimeter discipline and the airport supervisor signaling all nearby service traffic to reroute around the ceremonial corridor. He tracked the little girl's mother, who had moved her chair back 6 inches to keep clear sight lines while still shielding her daughter's view from the worst expressions in the crowd. Nothing escaped his attention, because attention itself was part of the oath. For Darren, this was never about wounded pride. Pride had no place in a mission like this. The issue in front of him was sacred protocol breached in public during a repatriation operation. The correction had to accomplish 3 objectives simultaneously: restore ceremonial integrity, protect civilians, and teach the exact boundary that had been crossed so every witness carried the lesson forward. He had done this kind of multi-dimensional assessment in combat zones under mortar threat. The geography had changed. The standard had not. Thomas glanced at the badge above Darren's heart and understood with final clarity who his grandson had challenged. He had recognized it earlier, but now recognition became personal indictment. Tomb guard. Old guard. A man selected, tested, and trusted to stand where the nation's grief required absolute precision. Thomas's own service had taught him the hierarchy of symbols. A rank could be earned and retired, a role could rotate, but some assignments were not jobs so much as vows wearing uniforms. He felt his throat tighten around words he did not often speak. "Bryce," he said, and the boy finally met his eyes. "That soldier stands for people who cannot defend their own names anymore. You do not get to mock that because you want a clip." Bryce looked toward the crowd, searching for one sympathetic face and finding none. The social mathematics he relied on had inverted. There was no audience to conquer here, only witnesses measuring him against standards he had never accepted. He swallowed, jaw flexing, and said nothing. The fluorescent spill on the pavement caught another strip of light and seemed to glow brighter for a second, an ugly marker of what had happened. Darren let the image fix in his mind. Physical evidence in ceremonial space. Breach point identified. Required correction pending. He drew one quiet breath through his nose and felt old muscle memory settle into alignment. His shoulders remained level. His gloved fingers stayed flat along his trouser seams. Externally, he was still a statue. Internally, every system was active. The crowd sensed the shift without seeing movement. Conversations died mid-whisper. The Marine lowered his salute at last, not from diminished respect, but because he needed both hands on his cane. And even that small motion sounded loud in the hush. The little girl in the wheelchair leaned forward until her mother touched her shoulder and gently eased her back. "Watch his face," the mother whispered. "He's deciding." The retired nurse answered softly. "No, he already decided. He's deciding how to do it right." Seconds lengthened again, but this time they carried structure. Darren's internal map updated in tight sequence. Threat level moderate, localized, non-armed. Secondary agitators absent. Civilian crowd compliant and observant. Law enforcement support available, but waiting on ceremonial lead. Mission clock active with inbound transfer movement, likely within minutes. Corrective action must be immediate, proportional, and publicly intelligible. Every branch ended in the same necessity. The offender had to acknowledge the lane, the flag, and the fallen in direct terms, not vague regret. Anything less would leave the breach conceptually open. He heard the wind pull at a loose corner of barricade fabric and file across metal rails with a dry rasp. He heard a distant baggage loader reverse alarm cut off abruptly as the operator silenced it in respect. He heard Bryce's breathing turn uneven, then controlled, then uneven again. He heard Thomas murmuring something too low for civilians to catch, likely the old cadence of correction he had once used with young privates. Stand up, face forward, do not lie, own it. 3 days had passed since Darren last stood the midnight walk at the tomb, but ritual did not leave him when he stepped off marble. It moved with him into every assignment. 21 steps. Pause, turn, 21 steps back. The cadence lived in his spine now, a metronome for judgment under pressure. On the apron, he was not pacing, yet his mind used the same rhythm to regulate response. Assess, hold, align, act. That cadence kept anger from contaminating duty. It kept correction from becoming spectacle. Across the barrier, one of the high school boys whispered to his friend, "Is he going to get arrested?" The friend shook his head, eyes fixed on Darren. "He's going to get taught." Airport police remained exactly where they needed to be, hands near belts but not raised, eyes alternating between Darren and Thomas for cues. They had seen enough military operations to recognize when command authority was being exercised with precision. Their sergeant gave a subtle nod to his partner. "Whole line? No premature entry?" Thomas finally released Bryce's forearm, but stayed squarely beside him, a human brace. "When he addresses you," he said, voice flat and unyielding, "you answer correctly." Bryce's chin lifted by reflex, a last attempt at resistance. Thomas did not blink. "Correctly." The boy's chin lowered. Darren could feel the entire perimeter waiting for his voice, and he understood what that meant beyond this moment. The 2 teenagers near the barrier would remember whatever happened next and carry it into whatever men they became. The little girl in the wheelchair would remember whether sacred things were defended calmly or abandoned under ridicule. Thomas would remember whether military discipline still had the moral force he had spent a life believing in. Even Bryce, despite himself, would remember the shape of consequence if it was delivered without cruelty and without wavering. That was why the build mattered. Not drama. Clarity. He shifted his focus from the horizon point to the exact spot where the bottle had come to rest, then to Bryce's face, then to the flag patch on the little girl's armrest, then back to neutral bearing, one measured cycle. Final alignment. The mist thinned enough that the first true gold of morning touched the edge of Darren's cap brim and the brass at his collar. White headstones remained visible above the access road, steady and distant like a jury beyond appeal. In that light, Bryce seemed younger and smaller than he had looked, with the phone raised, stripped of filters and angles. Just a 17-year-old standing in front of a standard he had never expected to meet. Darren settled his weight, threw polished soles into cold concrete, and prepared to break stillness with the minimum force required and the maximum authority permitted. When he moved, it would be one protocol-sanctioned step, nothing more. When he spoke, it would be one line, no excess, no heat. And everyone on that apron would understand exactly where the sacred boundary stood. Darren moved. It was one step, exact and sanctioned, heels striking the tarmac with a clean report that cracked through the hush like a ceremonial drumbeat. Not a lunge, not a threat display. A measured advance from sacred stillness into active authority, the kind of movement that said the boundary had been crossed and was now being redrawn in steel. The crowd inhaled as one body. His left boot settled on the painted line, mirror-bright leather cutting across the fluorescent spill without touching it. His shoulders remained squared. His rifle stayed controlled at regulation angle. White gloves remained immaculate, fingers disciplined, no tremor, no excess. He turned his head just enough to place Bryce Kellen in full command gaze, eyes hard and clear under the brim. And for the first time that morning, the teenager understood what his grandfather had already known. This was not decorative silence. This was combat-calibrated restraint in ceremonial form. Darren's voice came low, formal, and unyielding. You will retrieve what you threw, face the flag, and apologize to the fallen you just mocked. No one spoke. Engines, wind, radios, all of it seemed to retreat behind the weight of that single sentence. Bryce froze with his mouth half open, the reflexive denial rising and then dying before it reached sound. His face drained of color, then flushed again, then settled into the stunned look of someone who had finally met a standard immune to performance. He glanced toward the barrier, searching for escape routes through bystander sympathy, and found only veterans, parents, workers, and students watching him with the same demand. Do it right. Thomas acted before the silence could fracture. His hand locked on Bryce's forearm with old Sergeant certainty and turned him toward the lane. Move, he said, each letter clipped to command length. Now. Bryce stumbled one step, then resisted for a fraction of a second. Thomas tightened his grip. No arguments. Retrieve it. At 6:14 a.m., with dawn finally burning through the last low mist, the teenager crossed the line he had mocked and walked into the lane under the eyes of an entire country in miniature. His expensive sneakers darkened at the edges where neon liquid had spread. He crouched, picked up the bottle with 2 fingers like it might stain him, then straightened too fast and nearly lost balance. The high school boys at the barrier watched without blinking. The retired Marine planted both hands on his cane and held Bryce in a stare that carried 40 years of funerals and reunions and names engraved in stone. Darren did not move again. One step had been enough. Face the flag, he ordered. Bryce turned toward the mounted colors near the service building, shoulders uneven, chin dropping despite himself. Thomas released his forearm only after positioning him square. The grandfather then stepped back half a pace and came to a rigid, trembling attention, as if he were standing inspection beside a private who had failed the unit. Speak clearly, Thomas said. Bryce swallowed. His first attempt came out thin. I'm sorry. Darren's gaze stayed locked. To whom? Bryce's throat worked. The retired nurse watched him with hard, quiet expectation. The little girl in the wheelchair leaned forward, blanket slipping from one shoulder, until her mother drew it back up and squeezed her hand. Bryce tried again, louder this time, voice shaking but audible across the apron. I apologize to the fallen service members. I disrespected this lane. I was wrong. The words landed and held. A sharp gasp moved through the onlookers, not of shock now, but release. Someone near the back whispered, Good. Another voice answered, About time. The mother with the young boy lowered her own hand from her son's shoulder and let him keep his salute on his own strength. The pilot put his cap back on slowly, expression sober. Darren gave one precise nod. Place the bottle in the waste bin by the barricade. Return to your position. Bryce obeyed immediately. No swagger remained. He carried the bottle to the nearest bin, dropped it, and returned to stand beside Thomas with both hands visible and eyes down. Thomas reached into his coat, removed the phone, and without ceremony handed it to Airport Police Sergeant Mallory at the perimeter. Evidence of disorderly conduct and harassment, during military transfer protocol, Thomas said, voice flat. Log it. Mallory accepted the phone with a short nod. Received. That closed one thread cleanly. The live stream was dead. The recording secured. The device now part of formal process instead of social theater. Darren shifted his eyes to the spill marks still ghosting the painted line. Request cleanup at lane edge, he said, projecting just enough for operations staff without breaking cadence. The civilian supervisor answered at once from behind the barrier. Copy. Sanitization team standing by. Hold until transfer passes. Understood? Physical evidence noted, controlled, and deferred to mission priority. Nothing improvised, nothing forgotten. Then the countdown converged. A dark military SUV with district plates rolled up the service road and stopped short of ceremonial space. The rear door opened before the engine fully settled. Brigadier General Eleanor Voss, Military District of Washington, stepped out in service dress with ribbons bright against morning gray, flanked by a lieutenant colonel carrying a leather folio and a military police captain moving at her shoulder. Her pace was brisk but contained, the pace of someone briefed en route and already at decision. The crowd parted along the barricade instinctively. Whispers rippled, then died. General Voss took in the scene in one sweep. Sentinel one step off original mark, offender compliant, grandfather at attention, police holding perimeter, lane preserved, witnesses orderly. She stopped 6 feet from Darren, returned his salute with sharp precision, then turned to Sergeant Mallory. Report. Mallory spoke without embellishment. At approximately 0612, juvenile male Bryce Kellen threw a half-full sports bottle into designated repatriation lane and verbally mocked ceremonial guard. Sentinel Rodriguez issued corrective command within ceremonial authority. Offender retrieved object, faced colors, and delivered public apology. Device used for recording is in evidence. No injuries. Lane integrity restored pending cleanup after transfer. General Voss nodded once. Any dispute on sequence? Thomas answered before anyone else could. No, ma'am. I am retired Sergeant First Class Thomas Kellen, guardian of the juvenile. The report is accurate. The sentinel was measured and proper. General Voss studied him for a beat, then Bryce. Name? Bryce Kellen, ma'am. Age? 17. Her voice did not rise. You disrupted a sacred military operation and disrespected the dead on federal ground. You will listen carefully, because this is not negotiable. Bryce lifted his eyes just enough to show he heard. General Voss angled back toward Darren and spoke loud enough for every witness. Sentinel Rodriguez acted precisely within ceremonial authority. His response protected mission integrity, civilian order, and the dignity of the fallen. This command stands fully behind his actions. The words hit the apron like a gavel strike. Authority validation, public and absolute. The retired Marine exhaled and murmured, "Damn right." The high school boys exchanged a look of astonished respect. The retired nurse closed her eyes briefly, relief softening her jaw before discipline reset her expression. General Voss turned to the police captain. Proceed with juvenile citation for disorderly conduct and interference with official military protocol. Coordinate with guardian signature. Ma'am. She turned to the lieutenant colonel with the folio. Draft memorandum to Arlington Volunteer Coordinator. Minimum 60 service hours, supervised, focused on ground support and visitor assistance. Include educational orientation on tomb protocol. Completion report due to this office. Already templated, ma'am. I'll finalize on site. External contact created and immediately resolved. Arlington coordinator called from the lieutenant colonel's secure phone within 30 seconds. Speaker low, but audible enough to confirm acceptance. Coordinator Reeves, this is Lieutenant Colonel Harlan, MDW. Mandatory juvenile service assignment incoming, 60 hours minimum, first availability this Saturday. A pause. Confirmed. I'll transmit documents in 10 minutes. He ended the call and nodded to General Voss. Done. Bryce heard every word. His shoulders folded inward, humiliation now stripped of drama, and replaced by consequence that would last beyond the morning. Sergeant Mallory produced a citation form on a tablet, then a printed acknowledgement from a patrol car kit. Mr. Kellen, he said to Thomas, guardian's signature required. Juvenile copy and court notice will be delivered electronically by noon. Thomas signed with a steady hand. Understood. Mallory then looked to Bryce. Phone remains impounded, pending review. You do not post from this incident. You do not contact witnesses. Violation adds charges. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Bryce said, voice barely above a whisper. Louder. Yes, sir. General Voss gave one final glance to the spill mark and cleanup crew waiting with absorbent pads at the far edge. After transfer passes, clear that line to original condition. The supervisor answered, Team ready, ma'am. Thread by thread, the breach closed. General Voss faced Darren again. Sentinel Rodriguez. Ma'am. Resume mission posture. Darren stepped back exactly one pace, returning to his original position, as if drawn on rails and settled into ceremonial stillness, with no visible residue of confrontation. The transformation was immediate and complete, from corrective authority back to silent guardian, duty uninterrupted. Thomas turned to Bryce and spoke so only those nearest could hear. You will remember this morning for the rest of your life. Bryce nodded once, eyes still lowered. Yes, Sergeant. Not Grandpa. Sergeant? The little girl in the wheelchair watched Darren return to stillness, then looked up at her mother. He fixed it, she whispered. Her mother brushed a thumb across the unit patch on the armrest. He did. The retired nurse leaned toward them and said quietly, That is what discipline looks like when it protects memory. General Voss stepped out of ceremonial space, her team following. Before entering the SUV, she paused and addressed the gathered witnesses in a firm, caring tone. This lane honors Americans on their final journey home. Respect here is not optional. Thank you to those who upheld it. She departed as quickly as she had arrived. On the apron, order settled back into place. Police resumed perimeter. Cleanup crew held it ready. Thomas stood beside his grandson, both silent now, one chastened by shame, the other by revelation. The crowd remained hushed, but the hush had changed from tension to reverence restored. And at the center of it all, Darren Rodriguez stood unwavering, eyes locked on a point only he could see, the sacred boundary intact again under the morning light. The hush held for another 40 seconds. Then the low thrum of turbofans rolled across the apron, and every witness understood that the morning's true purpose had arrived. A gray transport aircraft eased toward its mark beyond the service road, lights cutting through thinning mist, and conversation vanished without instruction. Darren remained fixed at ceremonial attention, one silent line of order inside a vast choreography of grief, while ground crews moved only where signaled and nowhere near the lane. Thomas Kellen touched Bryce's sleeve once and said, Eyes forward. The teenager obeyed immediately. When the aircraft door opened and the transfer team formed, even the wind seemed to quiet. The retired Marine straightened against his cane. The high school boys removed their caps again. The mother beside the wheelchair set her hand over her heart, and her daughter copied her with small, determined fingers. Darren did not look toward the crowd. He looked down the lane he had just defended and held it for the fallen now crossing it. The movement was measured, precise, and unbroken. Commands came in low cadence. Boots struck concrete in perfect intervals. The flag-draped transfer case passed through the corridor with a dignity so complete it seemed to alter the scale of the place. An airport apron became sacred ground because disciplined people treated it as such. Bryce watched, with his mouth slightly open. All performance gone. Thomas did not look at him, but he felt the shift and kept his jaw set, letting the moment do its work. No one clapped. No one spoke. Reverence needed no soundtrack. When the transfer detail cleared the marked lane and the escort vehicles began to roll, Darren held position until final command authority released the corridor. Only then did he project, "Lane clear for sanitization." The cleanup crew moved in fast and quiet, absorbent pads and neutral solution in hand. The fluorescent residue vanished in under a minute, then the concrete was rinsed and dried until no trace remained. The civilian supervisor walked the line personally, crouched once, ran a gloved thumb over the spot where the spill had been, and nodded to Sergeant Mallory. "Restored to original condition." Mallory answered, "Logged." He then retrieved the discarded sports bottle from the waste bin with a clear evidence bag, photographed it beside the citation number, and added a note to his tablet. "Item documented and disposed per airport hazmat protocol after record capture." The chain was complete. Nothing left ambiguous. Lieutenant Colonel Harlan returned with printed forms clipped inside a slim folder. He handed one copy to Thomas, one to Mallory, and kept one for district records. Arlington Coordinator confirmed intake, Saturday 0700, ground support detail, 60 hours minimum. Educational briefing on tomb protocol included first day. Completion reports to MDW every 2 weeks. Thomas scanned the page, then passed it to Bryce without a word. Bryce read the first line, swallowed, and nodded. Understood. At 6:41 a.m., Thomas's phone buzzed with the promised electronic court notice. He opened it, showed Mallory, and signed digital receipt in full view of his grandson. External report delivered. Guardian acknowledgement complete. Mallory countersigned and sent confirmation to Juvenile Services before he stepped away from the barricade. The retired nurse, who had watched all of it with stern attention, finally exhaled. Thomas turned toward her, then toward the Marine, and gave a small nod that carried apology without theatrics. "He'll do the hours," he said, "and he'll do them right." The Marine answered, "See that he does." Bryce faced both of them and managed the hardest sentence of his life so far. "I will." Near the barrier, the little girl in the wheelchair tugged her mother's sleeve. "Can I thank him?" Her mother looked to an MP corporal, who checked with Mallory, who checked with Darren's detail lead. The answer came back in a quiet chain of permission. One brief approach at perimeter distance, no interference with active posture. They rolled forward to the marked edge. The girl sat very straight, red blanket tucked tight, unit patch visible on her armrest. Darren remained motionless, gaze fixed ahead. She spoke anyway, voice clear in the cold air. "Thank you, Sentinel." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Darren's bearing remained unchanged, exact and formal. But the girl seemed to read that unbroken posture as her answer. Her eyes brightened with the solemn pride children carry when they are treated as part of something larger than themselves. Thomas stepped Bryce forward one pace, just enough to stand in line with the child, the Marine, the students, the workers. "You have one more thing to say," he murmured. Bryce looked at Darren, then at the lane, then at the distant rise of Arlington beyond the road. "I understand now," he said, not loud, not performative. "Yes, Sergeant." This time he was speaking to his grandfather, but the respect was no longer borrowed. The airport gradually returned to ordinary motion. Carts resumed routes. Radios came back up to working volume. The gulls returned over the river fence, circling where they had kept away earlier, and the terminal windows that had thrown sharp glare at dawn now reflected clean daylight without disrupting anyone's sightline. Every strange edge Darren had catalogued that morning either resolved or proved harmless, and that mattered because vigilance is measured not only by threats that arrive but by risks tracked and closed. By 2:10 p.m., Darren was back on Arlington Marble. Clouds had lifted. The afternoon light came crisp across the amphitheater, flag moving in a measured wind, rows of headstones stepping down the hills in white geometry that made silence feel architectural. Tourists lined the rail in respectful clusters. Veterans stood with hats over hearts. A school group whispered questions their teacher answered in reverent tones. Among them near the back stood Thomas and Bryce in plain clothes, both still, both attentive. A few yards away, the little girl in the wheelchair sat between her mother and the retired nurse, red blanket folded neatly across her lap. The relief ceremony ended. Darren took his post. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm on the black mat and marble edge. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. 21 steps back. Rifle shoulder shift precise. Chin angle exact. Face unreadable and alive with discipline. The cadence that had held the lane at the airport now resumed where it belonged in the oldest watch he had vowed to keep. To most of the crowd, it looked like ritual. To those who had witnessed the apron that morning, it looked like continuity. The same man, same standard, same refusal to let ego touch sacred duty. Bryce watched each turn as if memorizing a language he had never been taught. Thomas watched Bryce instead of the mat for several passes, then finally let his eyes return to Darren. Relief and sorrow mingled in equal measure. The retired nurse leaned down to the little girl and whispered, "Do you remember what your mother said?" "Not a statue." The girl nodded. "A soldier." "A sentinel," the nurse said softly, and the child smiled without taking her eyes off the march. She lifted a careful salute from her chair. Darren did not break bearing or alter cadence. On his next pass, his posture remained level and exact, and she held the salute as if that steadiness itself were a promise returned. After the changing of the guard, when Darren stepped clear of the mat under proper release, visitors were allowed to move along the designated path. Thomas guided Bryce to the side and stopped him before they reached the rail. "No speeches," he said. "Just respect." Bryce nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." They stood together, hats off. No phone in Bryce's hand, no smirk, no angle seeking attention. Just a teenager facing marble names and one unnamed tomb, letting silence teach what noise never had. The little girl lowered her hand and settled it back onto the blanket, still watching quietly as the line advanced. As the sun lowered, the flag kept its measured motion above the plaza. White headstones caught amber light. The crowd thinned but never dissolved into disrespect. Thomas and Bryce remained until the next relief began, then departed quietly toward the visitor path. Volunteer intake folder tucked under Thomas's arm where it could not be forgotten. Darren continued his walk. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Boots on marble, rifle steady, uniform immaculate. A vow carried forward in silence while the nation moved around him, free because men and women beneath those stones had paid the full price. On that hill, in that cadence, the morning's breach had no final word. Honor did.